Judge asked my biological parents' lawyer to state the legal basis for their claim, and I watched the man shuffle his papers twice before he answered. I was sitting at the respondent's table alone. No lawyer beside me. Just a notepad, a pen, and 24 years of knowing exactly what my parents were capable of. Let me go back to the part that actually matters. I was 6 years old when my mother told me to sit on the bench inside the Greyhound station in Sudbury and wait while she and my father went to get the tickets. She tucked my jacket around me. She said, "Don't talk to strangers." She said, "We'll be right back." I remember the smell of the place, burnt coffee and floor cleaner and something diesel underneath everything. I remember the tiles were gray and cracked near the far wall. I remember sitting very still because she had told me to, and I was the kind of child who did what she was told. They did not come back. I sat on that bench for 4 hours. I know this because a woman named Gail, who worked at the information counter later, told me she had watched me for most of the afternoon, kept waiting for an adult to return, and finally walked over at around 5 p.m. When she saw me crying without making any noise, she said that was the part that got her, that I was trying so hard not to be a problem. The police came. A child services worker came. I told them my name. I told them our address on Fielding Avenue. I told them our parents' names. I told them everything a 6-year-old could possibly tell them. And what happened next is the part I spent years trying to understand. My parents had already reported me missing, not abandoned. Missing, as in their daughter had wandered away from them in a crowded bus station, and despite their frantic searching, they could not find me. They had filed the report within an hour of leaving me on that bench. By the time the police connected my name to the file, my parents had already lawyered up, and the story had calcified into something that would take years to crack open. The Children's Aid Society placed me in emergency foster care that night. I slept in a room with yellow curtains and a plastic mattress cover that crinkled every time I moved. I cried until I fell asleep. I woke up and cried again. This went on for about 3 weeks before something in me just went quiet. Not healed. Quiet. I went through 2 foster placements in the first year. The first family was fine but had too many kids and not enough space. The second family meant well, but the father troubled constantly and the mother was overwhelmed. I learned to fold myself small. I learned to say I'm okay when asked, and to actually mean it in a detached, functional sense that had nothing to do with happiness. I was 8 when I was placed with Sandra. She was 61 years old, a retired school principal recently widowed, and she lived in a house in Lively with a large vegetable garden and a dog named Biscuit, who was approximately 900 years old and slept in a patch of sunlight by the back door. She had applied to become a foster parent after her husband passed because, she told me once, she needed someone to cook for. Her daughters were grown. The house was too quiet. She did not baby me. That is the thing I remember most clearly about Sandra in those first months. She did not speak to me in a soft voice or tilt her head when she looked at me. She just talked to me like I was a person. She asked what I wanted for lunch, like the answer mattered. She handed me a trowel and pointed at the garden and said the carrots needed thinning, and when I asked what thinning meant, she showed me without making me feel stupid. By October, I had my own section of the garden. 3 rows, radishes because they grew fast. The legal situation with my biological parents moved slowly and then seemed to stop altogether. I learned later that there had been discussions about charges, abandonment, child endangerment, but that the evidence was complicated by the missing persons report they had filed, by the fact that they had retained a good lawyer, and by the sheer bureaucratic weight of a system stretched too thin. I was not called to testify. Nobody asked me what I remembered about that bench. The case was eventually closed with no charges laid, which Sandra told me about one evening in a way that was careful and honest and left room for me to be angry. I was angry. I stayed angry about it for a long time. But I also had Sandra's garden. I had Biscuit, who eventually died when I was 11, and whose loss I grieved with a sincerity that surprised me. I had a school where a teacher named Mr. Fontaine let me stay after class to use the computer lab. I had a bedroom with a window that looked out over a birch tree that went gold every October. Sandra formally adopted me when I was 12. She did not make a large event of it. We went to the courthouse in the morning, signed the papers, and then she took me to lunch at a diner where I ordered a clubhouse sandwich and she ordered soup, and we talked about whether I wanted to try hockey that winter. On the drive home, she said, "This doesn't change anything about who you are. It just means the paperwork matches what's already true." I've thought about that sentence probably 1,000 times since then. I grew up in that house. I finished high school in Sudbury, graduated in the top third of my class, which felt like a miracle given everything. Sandra helped me apply to Laurentian for a degree in social work, which felt obvious to me in a way that was probably not subtle. I wanted to understand the system I had moved through as a child. I wanted to be the person who noticed the kid on the bench. During my second year of university, Sandra was diagnosed with early-stage ovarian cancer. She told me on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen while she was making soup. She said it like she was giving me information I needed to have, not like she was asking for anything from me. We talked for 2 hours. She told me what the treatment plan looked like. She told me her finances were in order. She told me that she had updated her will, and that I should know that when the time came, I would be taken care of. I told her we were not talking about that. She said, "We don't have to talk about it now, but I want you to know it." The cancer responded to treatment. She went into remission in the spring of my 3rd year. I made her a card out of construction paper because I had no money and it seemed like the right size of gesture, not too large, not too small, just true. She kept it on her refrigerator until she died. She died when I was 29, not from cancer, which had stayed in remission for 7 years. She died from a stroke, fast and quiet, the way she had always done most things. I got the call on a Tuesday morning. I drove 4 hours from Ottawa, where I was working by then, and I sat with her body for a while before the funeral home came, and I told her things I should have said earlier and probably she already knew. The will was read 3 weeks later. Sandra had been precise and organized her entire life, and her estate was the same. The house in Lively, some investments, her savings. It totaled just under $1.9 million, which I had not known and which caused me to sit very still for a moment in the lawyer's office while I processed it. She had left the majority to me, along with smaller amounts to her 2 biological daughters and a donation to the local library. Her daughters were not surprised. We had spoken before the reading. They were kind women who had their own lives and their own memories of their mother, and who had, I think genuinely, accepted me as their sister over the years. There was no conflict there. The conflict came from somewhere else entirely. I was back in Ottawa about 6 weeks after the reading when I received a letter. It was forwarded through Sandra's lawyer's office, which is how I knew it was serious before I even opened it. It was from a law firm in Sudbury. It was from my biological parents. They were contesting Sandra's will. Their argument, as I eventually understood it, had several layers. The first was that I had been improperly removed from their custody, that the child services process had been flawed, and that therefore the adoption itself was legally questionable. The second was that, as my original biological parents, they had a continuing claim to any significant inheritance I received. The third, which I had to read 3 times before I believed what I was seeing, was that they had incurred significant financial and emotional costs in the years following my disappearance, and that they were owed compensation. The number they were seeking was $1.9 million, the entirety of what Sandra had left me. I sat with the letter for about an hour. Then I called Sandra's lawyer. Then I called my closest friend from university, who had become a family law lawyer in Toronto, and I told her what was happening. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, this is going to be fine, but you need to understand they are hoping you don't know enough to fight this, and they are probably right that you don't, which is why you're going to learn." She could not represent me directly due to a conflict of interest in her firm, but she spent 4 hours on the phone with me over the following week, explaining exactly what I was dealing with. The adoption, she said, was ironclad. It had gone through the proper legal channels. I had been a Crown ward before Sandra adopted me, which meant my biological parents had already had their parental rights legally terminated by that point. They had no standing to contest anything related to me. As for the financial claim, she used a word I will not repeat here, but it conveyed her assessment clearly. I decided not to hire a lawyer. This was not a financial decision, although the cost would have been significant. It was a decision that came from somewhere harder to explain. I had spent my entire childhood being processed by systems and represented by people who were doing their best on my behalf, but who had never actually been me. I had sat in rooms while adults decided things about my life. I was not going to sit in a courtroom while someone else answered for me. I spent 3 months preparing. I read every document related to my adoption. I read the relevant sections of the Child, Youth, and Family Services Act. I contacted the Children's Aid Society and requested my full file, which I had the right to do as an adult, and which I read in a single sitting that took most of a Saturday and left me feeling scoured clean in a way that was painful and also, strangely, like putting something down that I had been carrying for a long time. There was a note in the file from the child services worker who had first placed me. She had written, "Child is remarkably composed, but appears to be in shock." She knew her address and her parents' full names immediately and provided them without prompting. Parents located within 24 hours but declined to be contacted about placement. I read that line 4 times. Declined to be contacted about placement. They had known. They had always known exactly where I was. I brought that file to court. The hearing was in Sudbury, which meant I drove back to the city where all of this had started, and I stayed in a hotel 2 blocks from the bus station. And in the morning, I put on a dark blazer and walked into the courthouse and sat down at the respondent's table alone. My biological parents were across the room. My mother was wearing a gray blazer. My father was in a suit. I had not seen them since I was 6 years old. And the thing I noticed, more than anything, was how ordinary they looked. I had spent so long imagining this moment, building them into something large and terrible, and they were just 2 people in their late 50s sitting at a table with a lawyer between them. The judge was a woman. She asked the plaintiff's lawyer to state the legal basis for their claim. He spoke for several minutes. He cited emotional suffering. He cited the cost of the missing persons search. He cited what he called the ongoing parental bond that biological connection necessarily creates. He was careful and professional, and I watched the judge's face while he spoke. She asked him directly whether he was aware that parental rights had been legally terminated prior to the adoption. He said yes. She asked him to explain the legal theory under which that termination would be set aside. There was a pause. I had my notepad open. I did not need to consult it. When it was my turn, I stood up and I said, "I would like to enter into the record the complete Children's Aid Society file from my original placement. I would like to enter the adoption order dated 12 years after my placement. I would like to enter a document from this same CAS file dated 6 days after I was found at the Sudbury bus station, which shows that my biological parents declined to be contacted regarding my placement. I said the parental rights of the plaintiffs were terminated lawfully and on record. The adoption was completed lawfully and on record. My adoptive mother had the full legal right to dispose of her estate as she chose, and she chose to leave it to her daughter. I am her daughter. That is also on record. I said, I have prepared to answer any questions the court has." The judge looked at me for a moment. She said, "You represented yourself today." I said yes. She said, "You did so competently." The claim was dismissed. The plaintiffs were ordered to pay court costs. I walked out of the courthouse at 11:40 in the morning. It was April, cold still, that particular Canadian cold that lingers in the shadow of buildings even when the sun is out. I stood on the steps for a moment with my folder of documents under my arm, and I thought about Sandra making soup on a Sunday afternoon, telling me the news about her diagnosis in the same tone she used for everything, matter of fact, clear, leaving room for me to respond. I thought about Biscuit sleeping in the patch of sunlight. I thought about 3 rows of radishes and how she had stood behind me while I thinned them, not helping, just present, letting me do the work. I drove back to Ottawa that afternoon. I stopped once at a Tim Hortons outside North Bay, and I sat in the parking lot for a while with a coffee going cold in my hand, and I let myself cry in the way I hadn't let myself cry in the way I hadn't let myself cry inside that courtroom. Not from sadness exactly, from something more complicated than that. From the particular exhaustion of having to prove again, in a room full of strangers, that you belong to what is yours. I have since used part of Sandra's estate to create a small fund in her name, administered through the local Children's Aid Foundation in Sudbury, that provides school supplies and activity fees for kids in foster care who might not otherwise have access. It is not a large fund. It is the size it is because that felt honest, not a grand gesture, just a continuing one. Sandra used to say that the best gardening is mostly just showing up. You do not force anything. You thin what needs thinning. You water consistently. You pay attention. I still have the trowel she gave me when I was 8. The handle has a crack in it that she wrapped with electrical tape one summer, and the tape is still there, holding. It is barely the beginning of what she planted. I still think about the bench sometimes. The gray, cracked tiles, the smell of diesel and burnt coffee. The fact I sat there for 4 hours trying not to be a problem. What my parents did that afternoon was a choice. And every choice like that, the kind where you walk away from someone who needs you, file a fraudulent report, decline a phone call about your own child's placement, those choices don't disappear. They accumulate, they become a record. Literally, in my case, a file sitting in a children's aid cabinet in Sudbury that I was eventually able to pull, read, and carry into a courtroom 23 years later. The thing they counted on was that I wouldn't know to look. The thing they miscalculated was that Sandra had spent years teaching me how to pay attention. I think about what it actually takes to do what Sandra did. She didn't have to sit down next to a stranger's child in a waiting room. She didn't have to ask if I wanted radishes or carrots. She didn't have to file the paperwork, show up at every school event, drive 4 hours to Laurentian on moving day, or tell me about her diagnosis on a Sunday afternoon with the same steady voice she used for everything. None of that was required of her. She just did it, consistently, for 23 years, because she understood something I've come to believe is true, that integrity isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a trowel with a cracked handle. It's electrical tape holding something together long after the person who applied it is gone. My biological parents' lawyer had a theory about what love entitles you to. The theory was, blood creates obligation, and obligation can be monetized. What the judge understood, what the record made unmistakably clear, was that they had voluntarily ended that claim the day they declined to be contacted about my placement. You don't get to abandon someone and then invoice them for the years you missed. The thing I had to learn, and it took me a long time to actually learn it, is that understanding your situation isn't the same as being consumed by it. I had to educate myself, really educate myself, not just feel wronged, but actually understand the legislation, read the documents, build an argument that could stand on its own in front of a stranger with the authority to rule against me. That process was not comfortable. It asked me to be precise when I wanted to be angry, to be organized when I wanted to grieve, to stand up in a room and speak clearly when every part of me remembered being 6 years old and very, very small. But I did it. And I think Sandra would have expected nothing less, not because she was hard, but because she never once treated me like someone who couldn't. What I know now is that the life I have didn't happen to me. It was built carefully, the way you build anything worth keeping, through consistent, small actions, through showing up even when it's inconvenient, through refusing to let someone else's version of your story be the final word. Sandra planted something in me that her biological daughters would be the first to tell you was not just money, not just a house in Lively, not just 3 rows of radishes. It was the belief that a person can know who they are without anyone's permission. I water it consistently. I pay attention. That's what she taught me.